Thanks for joining us. My name is Doug Cook. I'm a board member at NOFAMAX. And
it is my great pleasure to introduce Chrissy Petitpas, a senior biologist in the Shellfish Sanitation and Management Program at the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries.
So yes, my actual name is Christian Petitpas. I go by Chrissy, so if you ever see that on websites or you're trying to look up my name, it'll be under Christian. But I am responsible for managing aquaculture for the state of Massachusetts. And we have aquaculture is regulated both in statute and in regulations. And basically, we view the definition of aquaculture as anything that has some kind of intervention in the brewing process. Whether you're protecting it, you're feeding it, you're basically some kind of animal husbandry. If you're planting it and it's not put there naturally, that's considered aquaculture, and you would require a permit. So we have quite a bit of aquaculture in Massachusetts, but the vast majority of it is basically for Plymouth South. It's in the south coast and South Shore. We only have less than a handful of aquaculture operations north of the Plymouth-Duxbury area. There are a lot of reasons for that. One of the primary reasons is there are water quality concerns, particularly around the Boston area because of the Boston wastewater treatment plant effluent. Even though it's offshore, the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, which is a cooperative program between all of the states that are contributing shellfish into interstate commerce, the FDA, industry can show up and be a part of the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conferences. This entity that meets every 2 years, and they go over proposals to discuss the model ordinance, which is basically the implementation of the program. It's the document that sets the standards for shellfish safety so that all of the states in the nation that are producing shellfish have some consistent standards across the board. So this is just a map of where we are. I'm not even showing north of Plymouth on my map, because we have the one really productive aquaculturist in the room, and he'll be talking next. But the vast majority of our sites are on Cape Cod. We have some on the islands. We have a few in the lower Buzzards Bay, but this is pretty much where we have our aquaculture sites. We have about 400 aquaculturists going in the state. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have intertidal shellfish aquaculture, so that's between the high tide and the low tide. We have cages, we have rack and bag. Some people use line systems, and then we also have those that are growing clams that can put predator protection nets on. Next slide, please. And then we have sub-tidal aquaculture. So this is the aquaculture that pretty much stays submerged all the time.
So the other one is only submerged like half the day or something like that?
Yeah, depending on where it is. So it could be way, way up near the high tide line, and it's spending a lot more time exposed to the air, or it can be close to the low tide line, and with the rising and falling of the tide, it spends less time exposed to the air. So, and that matters, because if you're an oyster grower, during, and I will get into Vibrio, but Vibrio is a bacteria that has a threat of illness. And so your time of harvest in an intertidal site is when the tide exposes it. In a subtidal site, it's when you pluck that first shellfish out of the water. But when you're in an intertidal site, you're kind of not in control of your schedule anymore. The tide controls your schedule. So we have lawn lines. Some people choose to broadcast culture, so they'll buy seed and maybe they'll grow it in a nursery area to a certain size, and they'll broadcast it, and then they'll use a dragger to just harvest it. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just an overview of the most recent year that we have finished the data for, 2021. We have, as I said, almost 400 growers. That's that figure that's kind of cut off over here. Barnstable and Wellfleet are the two communities that have the most aquaculture sites and growers. We can see 48 here for Barnstable, 94 for Wellfleet for growers. But then the asterisks here, we also have that third sort of cohort where they have around 23 to 31. So we have Duxbury, Eastham, Dennis, and Plymouth. Next slide, please. So you'll notice Duxbury, Plymouth, they have far less growers than places like Wellfleet or Barnstable, but we actually have, look who's the #1 producer in value, it's Duxbury. So there are several reasons for this, and I should mention the vast majority of the oyster aquaculture in the state goes to that half shell market. So they're consumed raw. We do have some that go to fried po' boys, and actually during the pandemic, different programs tried alternative markets for cooked product, but because the vast majority of oysters consumed in our state and shipped off to other states is consumed on the raw shell, that raw half shell. When the pandemic hit and the restaurants closed, the oyster industry was the worst one hit by the pandemic. When we looked at the landings before and after, there was oysters that did not rebound by the end of the year. They stuck with about a 40 to 41% loss in value between 2019 and 2021. So in 2021, last year, we had over 30 million in total aquaculture. We had a little over 1 million in quahog and almost 30 million in oyster. Now there are other types of aquaculture. We do have some kelp. We do have people growing other species of shellfish, but I can't show you that because if we have less than 3 people and less than 3 dealers, so we have to have 3 harvesters and 3 dealers for confidentiality reasons, so that no entity can kind of figure out what one of them did. So we generally don't show and cannot share data unless it's in aggregate form. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to show you the comparison. So here's 2019, here's 2020. We can see, we had again over 29 million in sales and value for the aquaculture, the oyster aquaculture industry, and that dropped to 17 million in 2020 when the pandemic hit, because people just don't shuck their own oysters. They don't buy it and take it home, and that's another thing. Maybe people tried to remedy. There were videos showing you how to shuck your oysters, but the bottom line is people want to enjoy a raw oyster in a restaurant, not necessarily do the shucking themselves at home. So there was a major hit there, and as you can see from the slide before it, we actually rebounded, and we're doing a little bit better in 2021 than we did even in 2019. So there was a rebound. Next slide, please. And so I mentioned the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. This is the program that pretty much sets the guides. Our state law says that we manage the program consistent with the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. And the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, really their jurisdiction is for commercial harvest, but they set public health standards, and our law says we're not going to have different public health standards for commercial harvest and for recreational harvest. And so that there are some situations where that can be challenging, where we have to be conservative and follow the letter of the law of the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, or we could be found in non-compliance and taken off the shellfish shippers list, and then we could only keep our shellfish in the state, and a lot of our shellfish goes out of state. Next slide, please. And so part of the National Shellfish Sanitation Program requirements is to do some water quality sampling. We have our own lab that tests the fecal bacteria. We have one in Gloucester, and we have one in New Bedford. So I'm from the New Bedford office. And we have several kinds of classifications. So the green approved means that it's okay to harvest for direct human consumption. It's open pretty much all the time unless there's an emergency situation. We'll sometimes close if there's a major nor'easter, if we've had a prolonged drought and all of a sudden we have a big rainstorm, because now we have all that stuff flushing into the water that was on land, or if there's a harmful algal bloom, or what you might commonly know as red tide that produces biotoxins, or an oil spill. So those are the types of things that would close an approved area, but generally they're open all the time unless there's an emergency situation. Conditionally approved is open sometimes. There may be, so Brendan has one of these areas where we found that rain has an impact on water quality. So there may be rain thresholds. Once it rains that threshold, it'll close for a certain amount of time, or it may close when we test again. Different areas have different standards. Restricted and conditionally restricted requires depuration. So we have a declaration plant in Newburyport, and it's generally only used for soft shell clams right now, but it doesn't have to be. If it got validated and there was a demand for decorating other species, it could be. Prohibited, the red, that is not allowed to have any product harvested out of there for direct human consumption. Pretty much the only thing you can do in a prohibited area is grow seed for culture, and there's a size limit on that, so you can only grow it to 25 millimeters. And as you can see, that's one of the challenges the North Shore has. You can see there's a whole lot of red around here. And that has a lot to do with the wastewater treatment plant flows, the fact that a lot of communities have combined sewer overflows. And when there's a combined sewer overflow, it's essentially raw sewage or untreated sewage mixed with stormwater, and that's something that the NSSP requires a 21-day closure, and some of these are going off at a rate that we're just having overlapping 21-day closures, and it's just not something that's manageable. We may be working and getting our people out there constantly trying to reopen, only to close again to get, maybe a week's worth of time open. So we have that challenge. We're actually going through that in New Bedford right now. You can see there's not a whole lot of red over here. The FDA in their evaluation of us has found that we really need to do a dilution experiment, dilution analyses around these wastewater treatment plant outfalls, and they expect 1,000 to 1 dilution around it. And New Bedford has a very, very large volume of effluent that's going out. So we may see this area changing color soon. Next slide, please. Okay, so basically it's chapter 130, section 57, if you're interested, that gives municipalities the issuing authority. So municipalities for aquaculture. An earlier section gives municipalities jurisdiction over all shellfish. So they can determine whether they want to have aquaculture, they can determine whether they want to have commercial fisheries. The town of Provincetown does not allow wild commercial harvest in their town at all. The only commercial harvest in the town of Provincetown is aquaculture reared products. So really, the first step is go to your town. Next, please. DMS aquaculture responsibilities are, once the town decides that they're going to allow aquaculture, and they, as an applicant, you go to your town, you should be going to the shellfish constable and the shellfish department first, because if you're going to have opposition, you want to know at that level, right? It doesn't make sense to come to us, because we're just going to send you to the town anyway. So get all your ducks in a row with the town, make sure they agree with the site that you'd like to have, and then it's going to go before the select board. It has to be in a public hearing that's advertised, and then the town needs to send us proof that they advertised the minutes of the meeting and just say, hey, we want to license this site, can you come certify it? So DMF will go and do a site survey, and we're going to look for any important resources like eelgrass. We will, with very, very few exceptions, we will not allow you to have a site with any eelgrass on it. Sometimes, like P-Town is an example, they, 10-foot tides, they have vast amounts of flats, and they also have a very robust eelgrass bed within the deeper water. Well, occasionally shoots uproot, and then we'll see shoots established in the intertidal that is pretty much, open. There's no water for a large amount of the day. So we see these little ephemeral shoots that come and go. And so for the first time a couple years ago, we actually did okay a site that had just a couple shoots of eelgrass on it. We just put a condition saying, don't put gear on the eelgrass. It's probably not going to be there by the end of the season. It's going to uproot and go wherever it's going to go. And if we said no, pick another site, by that time that eelgrass shoot would be gone, and the site they picked, we have one on it. So generally, we want a 25-foot buffer between eelgrass, and then we'll look for shellfish. If there's no eelgrass on it, we'll start digging holes, and we want to get some kind of an assessment on the natural shellfish that's present on that site. Because when you get an aquaculture license site for shellfish, you have exclusive rights to all shellfish on that site, whether you bring it in as seed or it's there naturally. So we don't want to take a naturally productive site that would be open to the public and give you exclusive rights to it. But we will let you use that site to farm a site that's relatively unproductive. And then, we also control veterinary health. We don't want you moving seed around because there are a lot of diseases that can be spread. You want to be cognizant that what you're doing and what you're introducing to the site could be affecting your neighbors and their success. If you're bringing in a disease that could cause high mortality with their sites. And then we're worried about public health. So there's Vibrio, there's norovirus, because shellfish are filter feeding. They can concentrate contaminants at up to 100 times higher concentration than what's naturally in the water. Next, please. So any placement of organisms in the water requires an aquaculture license. Only shellfish requires, so any activities require a permit. Any shellfish activities require a license, and that's one of the distinctions, is that this whole municipal process is only for shellfish. If you want to grow kelp, we've actually had some inquiries about sea urchin recently. Those things are not under local jurisdiction. Although for all of those, we will say you should talk to the town first. Because the bottom line is, if there are major conflicts and we have the town going, no, 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 we're probably not going to okay it. So in all cases, start with the town, but you don't need a license if you're not doing shellfish. Next, please. Again, start at the municipality. We can skip over that because I kind of already talked about starting with the town. We do have, and we have a little QR code if you wanted to check out the site. Our extension people, Cape Cod Cooperative Extension, worked to set up this aquaculture siting tool. So it's basically a mapping site. So you can go on, you can get an interactive map, you can see where aquaculture is, and it also has different layers of resources that might be important in your application process. Brendan, I believe you used it, and sometimes it may not be as intuitive, but you can always reach out. You can reach out to me, you can reach out to extension agents, and we can help you out. And this is especially important. Next slide, please. Because we want you to have a very robust application process so that you know up front whether you're going to have issues later on. And so, I kind of went through this also, the site inspection, the site plan view, public and veterinary health. This is a site here where we went out, and the applicant was very, very upset because there wasn't this much eelgrass, but this is in the same embayment where we denied the site and saying we didn't know what eelgrass looks like because he dove the site and there's no eelgrass, but that's eelgrass, and that was what was on the site. So you don't have to do a site inspection. So in some of the applications, it'll ask for information on your site survey. I actually had a call yesterday, oh, do we have to do a site survey? No, you don't have to do a site survey, but if you did, we just want to know what your results were. Next, please. And then once you go through all those hoops, there's a whole other web of permitting involving a bunch of state and federal agencies, and it's confusing, and not all agencies necessarily know what the other agency is asking, and we're trying to work on having more communication. But this is probably going to be the most frustrating part of your process to get going as a permitting. Next, please. DMF did make an aquaculture permitting website. So this website kind of takes you through all the different state and federal permits that you may need, the time periods you may need to go through that process, some of the prices, the cost of getting those permits. So again, you can check that out. It's a pretty messy web, and it's going to be frustrating, but feel free to call us and reach out to the permitting agencies for some help. Next slide. And then you're going to need a propagation permit. Once you're done getting all your permits just to have your site, DMF will give you the permit that allows you to operate it. And we'll have different endorsements for the type of seed you can get, where you can get it from, whether you can have off-site culling, overwintering. Some people can set out spat collectors, and some people can sell their seed. And so if you want to sell, if you're in a place like Wellfleet where you have 100 growers with you, you may have a lot of seed that was successful, and you don't need to have it. Once it gets bigger, maybe you don't have enough room on your site to grow out the rest of them. You can sell it to other growers, or you could get a pathology test, and if you get your lot tested, we would allow you to sell it to other growers throughout the state. Next, please. Okay, and again, I mentioned non-shellfish, so we have no sea urchin aquaculturists at the moment, but I've been fielding some questions, so I have to do some homework because I really don't know much about sea urchin culture. But again, When it comes to all the other state agencies, it's the same process. The only process that's different is the local licensing. Next, please. Kelp. So again, no site license needed. A lot of people piggyback with shellfish. So if they already have a shellfish aquaculture site, they'll just get an aquaculture permit. So there are two different kinds of permits. There's a propagation permit, which is for shellfish, and then we call it the aquaculture permit for basically everything else. And so for kelp, you would need an aquaculture permit. Some people are choosing to do it on already licensed sites. Other agencies, there isn't really a good framework for kelp. We have been sort of using the NSSP standards for shellfish with kelp. So we don't want kelp being harvested in a prohibited area because they have been outbreaks. We're finding that we need to have a hazard analysis to find out exactly what the risks are. One of the biggest issues with kelp is that we have a lack of post-harvest processing infrastructure. Kelp needs to be dry for it to be marketable, and it's grown in the winter. They have a very short window for when they have to harvest it, and a lot of these growers were trying, they can't do all of this themselves. And we don't really have a lot of businesses in the industry in the state that are able to dry it so that they can put it into a form that will be taken up commercially. Next. We've had a couple people dabble with integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. So the idea behind our IMTA is that we kind of have like a closed loop. So we have fish or fin fish, and those require feeding, but they have a lot of output. Sometimes, they don't eat all the food, so that excess food gets back in the environment. They have biodeposits, they're peeing, they're pooping. And so the idea is, you get something like, in this case, they're showing cucumbers. I think I stole this from the Canadians website, but they're eating the biodeposits. All the excess nutrients can be taken up by kelp because kelp take up inorganic nutrients. The inorganic nutrients also stimulate the phytoplankton, which is what feeds the shellfish. So instead of having this, almost like, land farming, right? We talk about closed loop land farming. We've sort of segmented things. We put cows on these feeding units, and then now we have a cow waste program, whereas it's a self-contained farm. That manure becomes the fertilizer for the crops. And so it's kind of that idea. Next, please. So challenges facing the aquaculture industry. One of the big ones right now is interactions with protected species like the right whale. So we have limitations on when you can put long lines down. One of our first kelp aquaculture sites needed to get moved in. So he's in Duxbury, and he's one of the only people we have that are totally focused on kelp. He's not doing shellfish and kelp. He has his own site. Because Cape Cod Bay is a critical habitat for right whale feeding, we don't want long lines that could potentially entangle them and endanger them. The other issue is for floating aquaculture. It's something that's new in the model ordinance from the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. They're considering floating aquaculture a pollution source. So you have to have bird deterrence plans. Until recently, it was just sort of like, we think it's a risk, but recently we've actually had outbreaks. Rhode Island had one. There was a Campylobacter outbreak where I think almost 10 people got sick from eating oysters, aquaculture oysters, from a farm that was impacted by birds. I mean, you can see the bird poop all over it. And because this is a product that's eaten raw, that's something that is kind of become a hot topic now. We're required to enforce these bird deterrents. And if people can't get that under control, we need to see what the next step is. Are we going to make them submerge the gear? It's not clear what's going to happen. But right now, the approach is, you tell us what you're going to do. We're letting them try anything, even if it's put zip ties. But if we go out there and see that it's not effective, we're going to say, okay, you need to try something else. There are birds all over your gear. And it is affecting water quality, because we just recently grabbed a sample right next to one of these, and it is hot. And the problem is, if we keep collecting bad water quality samples, it's going to change the classification of the water, which means you can't be there. So it's a challenge. Next, please. Seed supply. So earlier, if you were here, you might have been listening to Brendan and I talking about the aquaculture center from the north here. And that closed, and it was really the only source of soft shell seed supply. So seed supply is an issue. The other thing is predators. We have crabs, carnivorous snails, worms. This picture here, Plymouth has a big issue. This is a tunicate, colonial tunicate, which is this kind of slimy organism, and they kind of call it marine vomit. You can see why they call it marine vomit, but it fouls not only the shellfish, it fouls the gear. So if they're trying to haul it up, it's heavier. And it's a challenge for growers to deal with the fouling. Climate change, right? We have rising temperatures. I don't know if you saw on the news the West Coast in recent years when they had the really, really hot long-term heat wave. The whole bunch of wild and cultured shellfish died because they just can't handle those extremes right now. And more frequent and severe storms. So a lot of the storms that we've had people, the gear gets washed up, their gear gets damaged if they have floats, so that's a challenge because we're getting a higher frequency of severe storms now. We're just seeing it, and I think you can see it too. Not only frequency, but severity, right? So we'll have long-term droughts, and then all of a sudden we'll have this massive pulse of rain that comes down. And so if that massive pulse of rain ends up having a lot of impact due to the rain washing land nutrients and land pollutants into the water. Shellfish diseases, we require pathologies, and there's, all of these shellfish have some disease concerns. Dermo and QPX are one of concern. Another one that's actually, now that we've opened up trade with the European Union, we want to make sure that people aren't taking shellfish and putting their shellfish in our waters because they have other pathogens and diseases of concern that we really don't want to start to have to deal with in our country. So there are all those things that we want to worry about. Next, please. That we don't want to worry about what happens. Vibrio. So the Vibrio is this very diverse group of naturally occurring bacteria in the water. It's there. It has been, but recently, since 2013, I believe, or 2012, we started to get some illnesses. So only a few of them actually cause human illness because they have genes that are associated with causing illness, the pathogenicity. There are over 80,000 illnesses every year, only about 500 hospitalizations, and there are about 100 deaths per year from vibriosis. And so Vibrio parahaemolyticus is the specific species of Vibrio that we have a control plan on in Massachusetts. And typically it's what you would think of a stomach bug, that gastrointestinal distress. And most of the time if we see really severe illness, it's in the elderly, it's in people who are immunocompromised, and greater than 80% of them don't even require medical care. Next, please. And so these plots show us when we started to have to deal with Vibrio. So as soon as a state has an outbreak, and the easiest way to have an outbreak, so there are different levels of the definition, but 2 or more illnesses that are connected to oysters harvested on the same day from the same growing area. So remember that map I showed you with the red and the green all broken up. So those broken up pieces are growing areas. If we have 2 from the same day, that could be one family. That could be one family, they both sat, family of 4 sat down, 2 of them got sick, that's an outbreak. So we've been fortunate to not have outbreak issues. It's not uncommon for our Vibrio illnesses, and I think we have over 50 illnesses that we've traced back. Not all of them traced back to Massachusetts waters, but this year alone we have over 50. And it's not uncommon to have a family, or you went out with some work buddies and you weren't the only one that had the oysters, but you were the only one that got sick. So there is some level of susceptibility there. So it was actually 2011. 2011 was the first time we had the outbreak. 2012 was the first time that we had to implement a Vibrio control plan. And so far, we have had no outbreaks linked to clams. We have illnesses linked to clams, but if we had outbreaks, we would then have to have the Vibrio control plan for clams. So we really, really don't want to have to do that. We're hoping that it just stays the way it is and we don't have to increase or have more burdensome requirements. And one of the requirements that we have, the primary requirement we have for Vibrio is icing. We require a lot of ice from May through October, and we may be revisiting the amount of ice. This came up at the Shellfish Advisory Panel meeting. We really need to have 3 inches of ice, and so that's something that we're going to discuss, but it's a burden to industry, it's a cost to industry, so this is another challenge. Next, please. The other one is harmful algae and biotoxins. The one we have the most experience with is paralytic shellfish poisoning, and the North Shore is typically the most affected by PSP. So this little box here, that is the Nauset system. The Nauset system has its own little bed. I don't know if you click it again, will it start the video? Nope, it goes back, okay. This was a video, but this is the organism that causes paralytic shellfish poisoning. So these are microscopic algae. These are things that are like 1,000 times smaller than the thickness of your fingernail. So it's the food, it's what the shellfish eat, but some of them are just bad players. They produce these bad biotoxins. This one causes an amnesic shellfish poisoning. We ended up closing much of the state in 2016 due to that. This one that sort of looks like a dinosaur in cell form is, it causes diuretic shellfish poisoning, and this same system had a DSP closure this year. And so as we have waters that are warming up, so you can see it, right? We're having warmer water further into December, and we're starting to heat up earlier. As we have climate change impacts, we have so we have the Gulf Stream that comes up around and brings southern water up this way. We're seeing more and more that the Gulf Stream is instability of the Gulf Stream, which means we have more and more rings peeling off. You can see it around here. Occasionally in the summertime, in the late fall, we'll see some tropical fish. Well, that's why, because they're coming up in the Gulf Stream. Well, I mean, we all heard the news articles and saw the segments on the Florida red tide, right? So there are concerns that as climate changes, we may have to deal with different critters too that may be bringing biotoxins and issues. So those are all challenges. But these 3 right now, they're currently problems in Massachusetts, and we've had closures because of them. Next. And then to wrap up, I just wanted to mention the municipal propagation. So not only are private interests propagating, we have municipalities. So all of these are deputy shellfish constables in different towns who are working. They buy seed, they plant them so that they can open it up to family harvest and recreational harvest. And some of them do have operations that propagate for commercial interests also. So they may have a section in the water body that's for the families to harvest, and they have sections that they just supplement and they try to help out their commercial industry. And so the towns, the municipalities do have to get permits from DMF also. Even though they have jurisdiction, DMF has to give them the permit to actually bring in the seed from elsewhere, plant it. If they want to use a prohibited area to grow out the seed, they still have to get it out by 25 millimeters. But there's a lot of work going on in a lot of cities and towns. But most of it is in the South Shore and South Coast. There's not a whole lot of it going on north of Plymouth and Duxbury. And I think that's the last slide. Yep. Questions?
So that slide of the integrated farm looked really good in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And then after the regulatory systems and agencies that she laid out, is it even possible to set something like that up?
So one of the challenges for that is obviously you need deeper water in most cases if you're going to have enough septic and to have a system. There actually was a workshop that talked about the IMTA. It's something where some people have tried it in sort of the embayments and they weren't very successful, but that model would probably be more successful in more offshore waters, right? Because for one, nearshore waters don't have to worry about, there's all kinds of nutrients. Most of our coasts are dealing with eutrophication, which is excess nutrients. So this idea that, yeah, you're going to have the shellfish and the kelp that are taking up nutrients from the system, but there's still excess nutrients out there which could be impacting how the system works within your current location. So I think location matters. And yeah, it is challenging, the permitting, and because you need to have it, I think probably a little more offshore, you're going to have the right whale issues. Kelp is probably going to be more successful north of the Cape because of water temperatures. The water temperatures are cooler, warmer the Cape, which will be more, you'll be more successful growing kelp north of the Cape, I think. And so, and that's where you have the conflicts with the whales. So yeah, it's not going to be an easy process, and it's something where regulators are talking about these things. That kelp farmer that I mentioned in Duxbury, he's actually testing out gear that he's trying to grow kelp on the bottom. So he's testing out gear that doesn't have vertical lines, so that presumably they will limit the impacts to entanglements and gear interactions with protected species.
Is it any different further north in like New Hampshire or Maine? Can you speak to those regulatory frameworks at all, or?
It's not very different, and you know, we still have we still need to go through the Army Corps of Engineers. We'll still have some of the same federal agencies that you're going to have to go to. So one of the differences is that most other states don't have that home rule for shellfish. So it's generally managed at the state level, which can streamline things a little bit. You know, if you're in a community that is all gung-ho for aquaculture, and yes, let's do this, then you know you have that support. But if you live in a community that just doesn't want to deal with it, the problem is with our home rule, a lot of our municipalities have bylaws that only allow residents of the town. So if you don't live in a town that is supportive of it, you're challenged to get an aquaculture site. You know, and there are other aspects to it also. You know, we have water quality concerns in a lot of these urban areas. So where we have a lot of our cleanest waters are very privileged, affluent communities where we don't have a lot of diversity, and so that can be a barrier to entry too, that residency requirement.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chrissy.